you all for being here today. I'd like to welcome you to Is This What Democracy Looks Like?, where we gather social media activists, leaders, and to work and improve to protect our democratic rights. So, my name is Ryan Hall. I am one of the members of Midwest Telegraph, and I'm grateful to be here today with some amazing folks talking about some very important issues. We see the dumpster fire that is our state and federal politics, and we are here because we care, and that we want to build bridges in our community, to make the important connections, and to say the important things that need to get said. And so, we will operate in this space conscious that oftentimes media and our activism leaves out those who are most marginalized, most vulnerable, and that their needs and concerns must be elevated and put at the center of our conversations. So we must build these bridges between media, between activists, between the most vulnerable, to communicate the need and to have hard journalism for hard times. So I'd like to introduce first Demita Brown, who is the founder of Midwest Telegraph. Demita has been involved with social justice work since the age of 13. Currently, she is building Midwest Telegraph, a mindful and anti-racist approach to social change and media activism. Demita, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Ryan. First of all, I want to thank you guys for being here, and I want to thank Ryan. Ryan is like the busiest person on the planet, literally, right now. He's running for city council, and he's one of the most conscientious and dedicated, enthusiastic, positive, hardworking people that I've met since I've been in Iowa City. I met him in the fall at an environmental action surrounding the Dakota Access Pipeline. And he's just fearless and fierce when it comes to putting himself in the community in a way that matters to people, that go beyond him and beyond his own particular community. He cares about all communities. So this is not an endorsement. However, I'm voting for Ryan. That said, Midwest Telegraph is a media co-op, and it wants to be a media co-op, I'll put it that way. We'll see what it actually turns into. We've been going since January, and it's really important for those of us who helped start it, and those of us who are engaged in it now, that we include mindfulness in the way we approach community work, and to kind of revisit values around cooperativeness and how to be allies in anti-racism and other kinds of oppression. So we're just kind of revisiting a lot of these values that a lot of us care about, and we're looking for ways to help people communicate about them and be allies around those things. A part of that work involves media activism, and a part of it involves creating opportunities for people to share ideas and get involved in community engagement. So one of our principles of unity is mindfulness. And what I would like to do right now is lead you all in a few minutes of guided meditation. We start all of our meetings with meditation. If you don't like meditating, or you already have a practice that you do, you are welcome to use that one. The technique that I'm going to teach is called shamatha. I'm just going to give you the short version. And if you want the long version, come to our brown bag lunches that happen every first Monday of the month. And the next one will be November 6th. So I want to invite you all to just get comfortable on your chairs in an upright position with your feet on the ground. And if you would rather like sit quietly and pray, that's also completely welcome. And then the idea is to sit up straight with your palms down on your thighs. And elongate your spine as much as possible. In other words, sit up straight. And let your eyes fall. They don't need to close per se, but they're just They're not necessarily looking, they're just letting light in. Let your shoulders relax. Shamatha means calm abiding or peaceful abiding. So this is posture, feet connected to earth, head connected to sky. Excuse me. And the breath is natural. We don't manipulate it. We just pay attention to it. So just noticing the breath coming in and out of your body. That's the object of this style of meditation. Noticing the breath. And with thoughts, they're going to come, and that's natural. We're not trying to manipulate them or get rid of them. But when we notice that they take us out of this room, we're just going to gently bring our attention back to the breath. So if your mind starts racing or you start thinking about what you have to do this afternoon, those things are important, but this is giving ourselves time to just be here now. So we return to the breath. And the view of this style of meditation is that by befriending this very moment, we enhance our capacity to be in our lives without distraction. To focus and to relax. So we'll do this for 2 minutes, bringing our attention again and again back to the breath. Pretend like that was a gun. Good job, you guys. So I want to pass it on to the next person, and that'll be right.
I don't get very many moments to share with other people to kind of be in the stillness. So thank thank you for participating. I'm going to introduce the panelists and have them speak a little bit about their work, about why they're here and why they think that this work is important. First, to my left, is Christine Nobis. She is the founder and chair of Indigenous Iowa, as well as the co-founder and chair of Little Creek Camp. She works for two nonprofits, Seeding Sovereignty and Seven Fires Media. She is Plains Cree Saulteaux of George Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada, and grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and has been living in Iowa for 10 years. She has a master's degree in Native American Religious Studies and a minor in Native American Indian Studies from the University of Iowa. Our next panelist is Simeon Talley. He is an event producer and marketer based out of the Midwest. Originally from Columbus, Ohio, he came to Iowa to work on the 2008 Obama campaign. His work focuses on building community among artistic and creative talent throughout the Midwest region.
I'm Simeon, that's not Simeon.
No.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going down the order on the program if you're following along, so my apologies. Our next on the pamphlet is Lyle Muller, who has joined Iowa Watch in May 2012 as its first full-time executive director and editor after serving as the executive editor of the Gazette in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He held several reporting and editing positions during 25 years at the newspaper, including the editor of the Iowa City Gazette, head of investigative and special projects, and senior editor. He was a 1992 Council for the Advancement of Science Writing National Fellow. He is a reporting coach for the Daily Iowans Ethics and Politics Initiative Project, a member of the Iowa Newspaper Association Government Relations Committee, the Iowa High School Press Association Board of Directors, investigative reporters and editors, the Society of Professional Journalists, and local independent online news publishers, and a former member of the Iowa Newspaper Foundation Board of Directors. He has taught political reporting and editing at the University of Iowa School of Journalism and Mass Communication as an adjunct faculty member. Our next panelist, arriving to the panel now, is Lisa Covington, a scholar activist who worked on the Justice for Tory campaign in San Diego, California. Lisa is currently the co-founder of the podcast and show Pretty Damn Interesting. The show shares the perspective of Lisa, Kenny, and John, three Black PhD students who discuss current events from Black perspectives. Lisa is a PhD student and Oberman Fellow at the University of Iowa. Our next panelist is Lauren Shotwell, who joined Little Village as the news director in September 2016 after working as an investigative reporter and data analyst for Iowa Watch and as a reporter for the Sioux City Journal. Originally from Kansas City, Lauren graduated from the University of Iowa with degrees in journalism, English, and Spanish. Our next panelist is Katie Brumbelow. Did I get that right?
That's right.
Awesome. Is the news director for the Iowa City Press Citizen, joining the newsroom in February 2016. She's worked in various leadership roles in digital and print for the USA Today Network, including at the Tennessean in Nashville and the Pensacola News Journal in Florida. She's a 2006 graduate of Auburn University, where her love of journalism began as a photojournalist for the school paper, the Auburn Plainsman, where she also served as editor-in-chief. Our next panelist is Letitia McDaniel. She has been an activist and community organizer for almost 15 years, getting her start in Dallas, Texas, protesting President George W. Bush and the Iraq War. Since then, she has organized many protests, rallies, sit-ins pertaining to Black and LGBTQ liberation and the intersection of both. She is the primary Facebook admin for Iowa City to Ferguson, which initially served as a way for local activists to get involved with events surrounding the murder of Michael Brown, but currently serves as source for local, national, and international stories of racial injustice and police brutality. She is also a member of Coalition Against Trump, CAT, a group born out of several Iowa protests of the current president and a way for leftists to connect, organize, and resist. And last we have Zach Kucharski, who is a UI grad and current executive editor of the Gazette. He has spent 17 years at the Gazette, and formerly covered school district issues for that paper. So if that is everyone, I'm going to kick it off by, I think we can go down the row, by just stating the sort of work that you do while you're here and what you were passionate about.
I think you already said that for me.
Yes.
You read our bios, right? So
Yes.
that's the work I do. Mainly, I work in the realm of Indigenous activism, women's rights. Particularly right now, I'm quite concerned with missing and murdered Indigenous women, which has become a crisis to a very absurd degree, actually. This has been going on in Canada for quite some time, but I feel like it's becoming more apparent now in the United States, which is important. But yeah, I work a lot with environmental groups, specifically Indigenous environmental groups, and of course, as everybody probably knows well, not me, but the Standing Rock issue. I was there recently and still fighting the pipeline in the Dakota Access Pipeline in Iowa. And I'm here because I feel strongly that we should recognize our biases and work with those biases. The bias. I feel that media will be stronger if they admit to biases and just like this, the work will be stronger. Yeah.
Alright. As far as what I've been doing recently, I've been kind of what you would call underground for most of my activities. So basically, education, as far as getting information out to people, as far as what we as a people, as a nation can do as far as resisting the current climate that we're living in. So as far as like educating myself, preparing other people through education, as far as like reading books on past revolutions, past resistance nationally and globally. So those are the kind of things I've been doing currently. And for why I'm here, it's because I feel like that we have this large corporate media that is kind of in control of all of the information that we are now getting. And I think we need to start investing in independent and small and people who are on the ground doing the work, and start getting their voices into what media is putting out there as far as information for the masses. So that's why I'm here, as far as like from the kind of the small fish in the very large pond perspective.
Excuse me. The Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism is a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization that exists for just two reasons. One is to do investigative and community affairs journalism in depth, in collaboration with other media, which usually is we do a story and we give it to other media and they republish it. And you've seen some of our stories, you just didn't know they were Iowa Watch stories. You thought they were registered stories or press citizen stories. The second thing we do is we train college students to do this work at a high ethical level. What we are trying to do is teach college student journalists that doing good in-depth journalism requires fact-checking, checking your the assumptions that you take to the story and make sure that they're not getting in the way of finding the truth. And to not use, to not use nighttime television as your model for what journalism is, because it isn't. It's nighttime television entertainment. It's not the craft of journalism. The reason I'm here is because I love these kinds of dialogue, and I could be ignorant and stay home, or I could come here and learn feedback, but also talk about the work that journalists do and the fact that there are codes of ethics and the types of things that we try to accomplish, and see if we can break through some of the assumptions that are made about journalism and figure out, all right, what really makes it work.
That reaches me. All right, cool. I'm Lauren Shotwell. I'm with Little Village Magazine. I'm here today because I'm passionate about journalism. Little Village Magazine is an alt weekly. We come out twice a month, but in the alt weekly style. And So we come to our work with a certain set of sort of, guidelines. We, have, if you ever pick up a Little Village magazine, it has sort of in the front sort of these areas that we focus on, environmentalism, social justice, that sort of thing. So we're definitely driven by that and make that very clear that that's kind of where our head is. And I just think that, it's important to also stress, though, that we do come at that with journalistic principles. We, use the same journalistic skills that I learned from Lyle while I was working at Iowa Watch, that I learned while working as a newspaper reporter in Sioux City. And so I think that, that's something that isn't always clear when people are picking up the magazine. I think some people kind of, when we're talking to people out in the community, they're like, oh, well, you aren't going to represent what I'm saying in the right way or in the way that I'm saying it. And we do very much try to respect, everyone's views, and what we're doing when we're writing the story is just trying to let people know sort of what's going on in their community. So yeah, mostly I'm just here to talk with people and to share topics that I'm passionate about, which is journalism.
Hello, my name is Lisa Covington. Mark, could you do me a favor and repeat the three things again? Because it was a lot.
Yeah, the work that you do, why you're here, and what you're passionate about.
Oh, the work, okay. Thank you. So I am the great granddaughter of enslaved Africans. And one of the reasons why I'm here is to ensure and resist the new Jim Crow that is happening all the time here. To resist the fact that in Iowa City schools that Black students make up 17% of the student population, but over 60% of the suspensions and expulsions. And so even though those might not seem like big deals, to some, part of the reason why the work that I do in media and in classrooms is important is to get their voices heard and to provide action steps around what to do next. I think that one of the things that I'm also resisting is the school to prison pipeline. And that's primarily for young men of color. Also for girls of color, the school to confinement pathways is something that they experience that's very similar, that often ends in similar results that might not lead to incarceration, but lead to things like eviction, right? Because Black women are evicted at high rates just as Black men are incarcerated at those same rates, right? So kind of recognizing the intersectionality of how Black people are impacted in our communities. And I think that what I'm passionate about is the work that I'm doing with Pretty Damn Interesting, with two of my friends, just talking about current events, Colin Kaepernick and 45, the president. Also, just talking about different things and while it's being recorded, right? So just providing ourselves as young, gifted, and Black students, PhD students, graduate students, with a platform to talk to our communities in the language of our communities, even though we have these letters behind our names. So again, I'll just remind you that I am the great granddaughter of enslaved Africans.
Hey everyone, my name is Simeon Talley, and I am also the co-host or participant in a local podcast named Political Party Live. The Political Party Live is a live event podcast series where we aim to talk about Iowa politics, Iowa issues from the perspective of three millennials, but through the podcast really aim to provide a platform for issues, perspectives, people, organizations that need a bigger platform, that should be getting greater recognition in Iowa. We try to do that in an event format that's interesting, that's engaging, that incorporates arts and culture. Some of the other co-hosts and people responsible for Political Party Live are Misty Rebick, Stacy Walker, Lynn County Supervisor, Maddie Bro, and for all of you downtown Iowa Cityans, Veronica Tesler, she's the owner of Utopia. So that's probably the reason why I'm here to talk about my work on the podcast and how we got started and the things that we're doing with that. But I think also worth noting is that I'm a co-founder of a new effort called Flyover, which is a new event and content platform that aims to make fashion more inclusive and representative by highlighting underrepresented and marginalized voices in fashion. So when we think of fashion, we think of predominantly white, thin, female figure. We think of fashion, a lot of the images that were shown are models that are super thin, that are very white. But when you look at, to take one example, women, 67% of women are size 12 and above, but only 3% of images that we see in the fashion industry reflect that. So we're trying to make, fashion more inclusive, representative, accessible, and representative, and that's a very political thing. And fashion is more so of a lens to sort of understand and talk about these deeper political, social, cultural issues. So it's great to be here. Thanks to Mita for the invitation. Thanks Ryan for moderating, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, I'm Zach Kacharski. I'm the executive editor of the Gazette in Cedar Rapids. I started my career down here after going to the University of Iowa, and I've been passionate and privileged to cover both communities. One of the things that I think, a point of view that makes our organization fairly unique in the media landscape is that we're an employee-owned organization, which is different than the majority of media organizations. And so we live with the decisions that we make locally, so we better make good decisions or we won't be around for very long. What gets me excited to participate in conversations like this, just like the massive amount of cultural and change that's going on in the community, journalism is undergoing a massive change as well, some for the good, some for the bad, and it's a fascinating time to participate in that, and what has been is changing very rapidly. And so I think that it's a fascinating period of time journalistically. One of the things that we're very passionate about really working to do is some of our engagement effort. We are trying to consistently engage with different groups and organizations and change how we participate in community dialogue so that we're less of a kind of distracted, distanced view and a more engaged one. That's something that you live and you learn as you go, and something that we're experimenting with within the organization. So.
I'm Katie Brumbelow, the news director at the Press Citizen. Zach and I, our organizations have a lot in common in the things that we strive to do in the community. With trying to find different ways to engage and evolve in the way that our traditional newspaper industry has changed over the years. The work that we do at the Press Citizen is very focused on Johnson County and the Iowa City community at large. It's evolved over the years. We used to have much bigger staff and have much more resources, and it's as we've had to downsize and change because of budgets constraints and just sort of the nature of the way journalism industry and the newspaper industry has changed. We've had to change how we focus and what we focus on, but at the core of what we do is really celebrating the things that are important in our community and also making sure that we're on top of the things that are changing and the things that are happening to make sure that our community is very much in the know about what is happening around them, to be able to make the right decisions about their everyday lives and to just be more informed. That's what I'm very passionate about is community journalism and what happens to our communities is related to elections, or is it related to different community groups who advocate for making our community a better place? One of the reasons that I came to Iowa City was because I was very excited about the community here, and that there are so many people who are engaged in making this a welcoming community for all people. And I'd like to see that happen even more. And I'd like to, as being a journalist, being able to shed light on the stories and be a part of that for everyone in the community. So that's kind of it, short.
Hi, can you hear me? So, I guess I want to be brief, but there's something that's very important to me as far as why I'm here. And that has to do with the role that ordinary community members play in shaping media conversations. So whose voices are at the table in framing those conversations? And what kind of historical and social context is created around the stories that do get told? I think those two things go a long way in diversifying the kind of news we hear, in diversifying and democratizing the conversation itself. So with respect to race, for example, now I want an honest answer here. How many people in here have heard about BIE? Please, anyone who's heard about it, BIE. I'll tell you what that means, Black Identity Extremists. Okay, so a few of you. There's a whole racial context that I think is missing from the news. There's a whole historical legacy that is missing from the news. And those voices are not at the table when it comes to shaping that conversation about race in this country. And we need to change it. If we look at white supremacy in this country and the white supremacist movement in this country right now, in 2017, I know the people who are in this room right now are just as terrified as I am about the fact that that is what we're looking at in 2017. We're better than that. And I want to put that into context. Our fear is what makes it possible for us to be fearless. Okay? And to put that into context, I want us to understand this surge of white supremacist activity as not representative of who we are. I think it's an expression of desperation, and we're better than that. But we need to have the conversation that bears that out. And if we're not having that conversation, if we're not learning how to be allies to people of color, to Jewish Americans, to Muslims, to immigrants, to all the ways that race is invading the conversation, but there's so much silence. We need to learn how to be allies in this conversation and in the movement to protect and strengthen and make democracy what it should be. There are indigenous people in this room right now who've never seen democracy. There are 7th and 8th generation African Americans in this room, 8 generations removed from slavery, who've never seen democracy. We're here to make it real. We're not pretending that we have something that we don't. So that's the race part. And the other part is media can contextualize these stories better than it does. So that it's an ongoing, instead of normalizing the idiocy in the Trump administration, let's normalize our real desire to live in decency in a democratic situation. Let's normalize a conversation about race. Let's normalize a conversation about justice. The media plays a role, and the community needs to have a voice in creating that conversation.
So that's going to begin our questions, which are on the back of your pamphlet. And I want this to be sort of interactive. So if you have a burning question or really want something addressed, please feel free, wave at me, and I'll be happy to try and communicate that. But I'll look at our first question because it speaks to what was just mentioned. There are voices in our community that have been historically underrepresented, villainized, misrepresented or ignored in mainstream society. So I will ask the panelists, and please just pop up if you feel so called to respond. How do we level the playing field in media representation of marginalized voices?
Well, I'll kick it off. And as with everything, there are complex answers to things, but instead of getting buried in that and finding that as an excuse, one of the things I look at, I was just looking up, the American Society of News Editors just came out in October with its annual survey of newsrooms, which they do every year, and found that 17%, a little less than 17% of the newsrooms across the country are staffed with people who would be considered to be minorities. One out of 4 news organizations have at least one minority in a position of authority. And so a simple answer in the complexity would be that there's not a lot of diversity in the industry for a variety of reasons, including people choosing not to go there, ranging from people choosing not to go there to poor recruitment. But as I think about that answer, I want to convey that the answer just isn't having more minorities. It's having more diverse thought, because people would argue that, well, there are women and minorities on the Supreme Court, but we're not particularly happy with what's coming out of there. There are minorities in different parts of government, but we're not particularly happy because the issue isn't that they're a minority, it's the point of view. And so when I think about the complex answer, I think that trying to get a variety of thought in a newsroom, because I certainly learn a lot more when I'm with people with diverse opinion from me or diverse backgrounds than people from Northeast Iowa who grew up in homogenous white Northeast Iowa where bologna and white bread is the food of choice. So that's kind of trying to give you some simple framework and some complex framework to argue and discuss.
I had a response. So I think that in my experience, that there will never be a level playing field because there's always 2 fields. There's always been 2 fields, and there will continue to be that. So I think that, I majored in communications and social change at Clarion University of Pennsylvania, and one of the things that I found when I graduated was that after I was called for an interview, once I got to that particular media source, that once they saw what I looked like, all of a sudden the attitudes changed, right? So it deterred me from pursuing a career in communication. And so I did some work in production with the Walt Disney Company and things of that nature, and worked on things related to film instead of journalism, as I was planning to. So I would say that opportunities are not opportune for everyone, and that's something that we have to remember, that there are 2 fields. Whether you like it or not, there are 2 fields. And it's just a matter of which one are we recognizing exists, and which one are we going to advocate for. So I think that that's the main thing. Another one would be, I think, tapping into resources like the National Association of Black Journalists is a really good way for folks to diversify the industry. As far as racial and ethnic and gendered diversity, I would also say that people of color make up the majority of the world. And so I think thinking of ourselves as global citizens is another way, right, to think about that. Because when you look at the numbers, numerically, people of color are the majority, right? And so I think that that's something that we just need to remind ourselves, that, even though we live in Iowa, if we are global citizens, then we need to look at our language, and then also how do we express that, that those realities. So I think that those are some of the key things that I would say about the level playing field.
I'll allow for another panelist to speak and then address a question from the crowd.
Thank you, Lisa. I was actually going to address that too, because we are minorities. I appreciate the words, Lyle. I just wanted to clarify, though, that we are the majority of the people in this world, and I think we should change the language of how we speak. But yeah, I wanted to just say something really quickly about how to level the playing field, and I'm involved in a community of people, a group of, well, actually many organizations that are doing great work within our Indigenous communities to provide young people and, well, frankly, anybody with cameras and access to media. And so that's how I think we level the playing field. I think that these larger media conglomerates and even the smaller ones that have any excess of money or funding can try and reach out to these communities and provide these people with cameras and a means to get their voice out there. That's how I think we should level the playing field.
Can I say something real quick, Ryan?
Oh, yeah.
I think this question sort of connects to a lot of other institutions or organizations or things that just aren't diverse. How do we get more women to run and be elected to office? How do we create more Black political or economic power, right? So this isn't something that's unique to media, but I think, sort of potential ways to level the playing field or just to sort of diversify media and media organizations, if we sort of think locally, I think a lot of local newsrooms have a lot of discretion and power with who they hire the editors and the contributors that they're working with. They can be more conscientious and deliberate about seeking more diverse individuals or just diversity of opinions and whatnot. To your point about empowering young people with cameras and the tools to go out and be sort of journalists themselves. If you're looking to sort of create a greater pipeline, this is, thinking more locally, your internship program could be a great way to cultivate new journalistic talent at a young level, right? A lot of these high school kids, they're so native and so, they get social media intrinsically, right? Intuitively, right? Empower them, connect them to your organization, create an internship program and make it diverse. I think that could be something at a very local level that could prove effective, but to sort of focus out a little bit. I hear Lisa's cynicism, and I'm going to try to offer a more optimistic path forward. I think that things will be right. I think that things can become more diverse. The playing field can be leveled. I think people in power will have to sort of make those strategic decisions that this is something that they value. But barring that may not happen as fast as we want it to happen, I think people are going to demand that media, that institutions become more diverse and reflect who they are, their communities, what they look like, the issues that they care about, or they're going to go out and create alternative media themselves, right? Just to take a very small example, I have a podcast, Lisa has a podcast, the media has a podcast. Who else has a podcast in here? Right? The reason, podcast is built on open source software, right? So eventually anyone here could, if they have the technology, you have a phone, you can download an app, you can record a podcast, and then within a day, within a short time, it could be on SoundCloud. You can find a way to get it on Spotify. You can find a way to get it on Apple iTunes, right? The technology and the means and the tools to sort of be media, to create a platform, to create meaningful content are at their most democratized ever. And I think that you'll see a lot more people of color, marginalized groups create their own platforms to get their ideas, issues, perspectives out there and create community around that.
I have an anecdote to share.
Sure.
I was a lower level executive for a Fortune 100 company. I was at a corporate meeting one day and I was referred to as the plant bitch, and nothing happened. After working for the company 30 years, I called one of my male colleagues a whiner, The next day I was fired. So there are, there are things that you just got to keep fighting for, In terms of current dialogue, I was watching Stranger Things this weekend. And I think what we're dealing with right now is this conversation is almost moot. We are in an upside down world here right now, folks. All the things we're talking about having a voice in an upside down world, things that were never legitimate are now legitimate. Having a voice is like almost the least of our concerns. We're just trying to breathe. I wake up every morning and look out the window to see if there's like a mushroom cloud outside my window. I don't know if any of the rest of you feel that way.
I would say that, thank you. I would say that this has been my reality my entire life. What you're talking about, like what you say, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think that's been, my reality has always been, like, the world's upside down, right? How are black men such a large percentage of the prison industry, but such a low percentage of the actual population,
And
right? So
I've
I
been
think
doing that as a female in corporate America.
Yeah. So white women often experience a lot of discrimination as well, right? We can see that with white women getting the right to vote in 1920, right? But also my ancestors didn't get the right to vote until 1964, right? So we have to recognize the similarities that overlap marginalized groups, but also how we all have privileges, and we have to figure out how to create allies, and maybe not even allies, but just moving from allies to be accomplices, because the world is so upside down for so many people now. And I would just like to say welcome, because this is this has been the world. And I think alternative forms of media, like Simeon was talking about, that we can already tap into that are a bit more mainstream or accessible. Blavity, right? Color Lines, those are both news sources that I get in my inbox every day, and it tells me what's going on in the world of people of color all over the globe, right? I'm not relying on local news or the television, right, to tell me what's going on with people of color, because I know that people who look like me are not going to be viewed in a positive light, right? Or if they are going to be discussed in media, it will often be through mugshots, right? So, and that's not the reality.
Van Jones, my heroes right now are black people. I'm Van Jones and his "You Can't Polish a Turd." That's on my mirror in the bathroom. So the only thing that keeps me focused right now are my fight against what's happening to minorities, right? That's the only thing I know that I can.
To who?
To minorities right now. The only
people of color?
Yeah, all sorts of minorities right now. There are so many. It's just a reason to get up in the morning is to know that that's someplace that I still have some control of what's happening in the world, because the rest is just.
So I'd like to take this moment to remind folks not to use the word minority, as people of color are the majority in the world. I know it's become pretty entrenched into our language, but even our language, our words they have encoded forms of white, patriarchal, supremacist tones.
Minorities and people of color.
Well,
there are all sorts of
about
people
that.
who are disenfranchised.
Let me say something about that. And I think that's, and I agree, you're right. That's the thing, that's kind of the weird thing about the United States, is that we think we're the only place on earth, and that there aren't Spanish-speaking people and there aren't people of color. But it's a fact that in the United States, in the census, people of color are in the minority. And if you don't call that a minority in the United States, you cannot then escalate to get rid of that, okay? That's just a thought that I have, is if you don't recognize that people of color are in the minority, then how can you identify the problem, part of the problem?
And perhaps I should also say that it shouldn't be incumbent upon white folks to say how people should want to identify. But I want to keep this conversation moving, and I think there were some things brought up in the last question asked about, you know, if we are living in such troubling times and have to rely on mainly white-serving institutions to provide journalism that, you know, has historically and continually is through a lens of this state of being, the white supremacist state of the Americas. How, and perhaps those who are affiliated with newspapers currently, how does your organization, your institution, address white supremacy in its journalism, in its makeup? How is that even a concern for your organization?
I mean, dare we say white heterosexual supremacy? I have a transgender child. Or we're not going to go there?
I'll try and say something. I mean, from the Press Citizens, I mean, we have had some discussions about white supremacy on our editorial pages. We also did, for a current example, the man, Jeff Pierce, who has the vendor at the farmer's market, who has expressed white nationalist views on his Facebook page, and there was push to get him removed from the farmer's market, which didn't happen, but people came and spoke and protested his in front of where he sells. One of the things that we did is we had people who sent in columns and letters. There were people who said, I don't agree with Jeff Pierce, but I agree that he shouldn't be, that he has a right to sell. There were people who say, I do not agree with these things. And then we had people who also, where we had a really great column from a woman who backed the protesters and said, I don't want this kind of thing happening in my community. I think that that's a really great platform to be able to allow people in the community to say what they think on the editorial page. I think that as newspapers, we can take stances on our editorial pages about that. And I also think it's important to be able to cover the things that happen in the community and not ignore them. Granted, it's hard. As being a journalist, it's really, we take a really strong approach to being objective as possible and to not be on one side or the other of certain things. On the other hand, personally, there are some things that are just not okay that I believe in. It can be tough sometimes. I know for our reporter who spoke to Jeff Pierce, it was really difficult, the conversation that he had with him, because he did not agree with the things that he said, but he had to have a conversation. And then fortunately, the guy was very open about the way that he felt and believed and wanted to have that dialogue. But I don't know, it's a really difficult thing to approach, I think, when you're trying to be neutral and objective, but on the other hand, feeling like this is not the world that we want to live in. We don't want this kind of, I don't want to live in a world where white supremacy is something that we just overlook. But I think that there's many ways that we can make sure that the public is informed about what's happening in their communities, to make sure that we're covering the communities who are marginalized and who are standing up to different things that happen in our community that have to deal with white supremacy, racism, all these things. Just looking at back in Murfreesboro and Shelbyville this weekend to see the white supremacy group that tried to march through, they canceled their event in Murfreesboro because people rose up. I know my former colleagues at the Tennessean, they had dozens of reporters out there that were making sure that they were on all sides of what was happening, and didn't cover it from a this is right or wrong standpoint, but covered it from this is what's happening and this is what the community is doing to make a difference. And it was just being able to see that happen was inspiring. And I just think it's really important for us to make sure that we're there and covering it.
I just wanted to just kind of piggyback on what you're saying. As far as coming from an activist perspective, I see how the media kind of they kind of pick and choose what's considered sexy out there. So they will cover a protest about a white nationalist, white supremacist, but they'll cover it from the perspective of the white supremacist or the white nationalist, and not necessarily talk to marginalized people. Or if they do talk to counter-protesters, they usually talk to usually white protesters when they come to protests like that. So I think the media does have responsibility to talk to the people who are most affected by white nationalism, white supremacy, which would be people of color. And so, and I understand as far as trying to have a level playing field and trying not to take sides when it comes to reporting, but there has been sides that have been taken when it comes to counter protesters and whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard. So I would say that that's something that media, especially local media, could really do work on. They usually have their usual suspects too. Usually especially they see me at a rally, it's like, oh, well, that's Letitia, she's pretty sharp, let me go talk to her. I'm like, I'm not the organizer of this rally or this protest or this event, so you need to talk to someone else. You need to talk to the person who, this group of, maybe it was something that was made by G World. You need to go talk to those girls over there who put this event together, and not me. So just being more cognizant of who is, not just who's at the table, but where are you putting the microphone? Where are you putting the camera? Because sometimes it is not in front of our faces.
Well, just to complicate an already complicated conversation, I think one of the constraints I hear a lot about from mainstream media, from independent media, from non-corporate media, is the interplay between how journalistic standards and coverage decisions is impacted by the bottom line. And I think one of the things that's changing in the industry, besides the concentration of the ownership of larger media outlets, is the way that is impacting even how news is reported on a local level, what gets covered. And I want to know more about that. I just want to say the Sinclair Group right now is a large conglomerate that's buying a lot of local stations and then kind of giving them this kind of prefabricated idea about what the news should look like, and it's very conservative. This is not a plug for me, but just read my column in Press Citizen, because I just talked about the impact of some of this. My question, though, and what I want us to kind of consider, I think Gil Scott-Heron was right. The revolution will not be televised. And one of the reasons is because of what Lisa just said earlier. There is a kind of, and also Simeon was pointing to this, there's a way in which we have access to creating conversations in a way that we haven't in the past. And so part of my question is, one, where is going to be the middle ground in terms of how we work together? There are established media entities that I think want our readership. What do they need to do to earn it? Should people be in our community creating the news if they're not going to acknowledge local voices, acknowledge people of color, acknowledge working class people, acknowledge youth, acknowledge some of the issues that are most important to marginalized groups? And, if we can democratize it without being dependent on that particular axis of power, for lack of a better word. In other words, leverage is different now. So there are constraints that all of us have to deal with when it comes to how the media is being controlled by larger corporations. And I think I'm losing my question here. But the point is there a basis for the more traditional outlets and the less traditional outlets that are in social media, that are doing podcasts, that are creating more democratic access to media? Is there a basis for alliance there that can navigate the attacks on free speech, the attacks on the press, the attacks on voting, voter suppression. Just about all of our constitutional rights are jeopardized now, and I see a need for looking at the possibility of this kind of allyship. So if my question makes any sense, please feel free to weigh in.
Well, let me try. If I read it correctly, the Second Amendment isn't under siege, but that's just me. I think dialogue is good. Oftentimes we kind of default to dialogue when we don't know what else to do that's concrete. We say, well, let's have dialogue about that, and then nothing happens. Many years ago, and this was before I was the editor of the Gazette, a previous editor came to me and he said, I would like you to figure out marginalized groups that we're missing and we're not reporting accurately, and round them up and bring them in, and we're going to have a summer of training sessions. And so I had an imam come into the Gazette, and a rabbi, and I had, you talk about your usual suspects, I had Janelle Reddick and Ron Butler come in, right? I told them, I said, I'm sorry, I know you're the go-to married gay couple, but I'm sorry, we need to talk to you, and you need to talk to us. And they were wonderful. We had people in the black community in Cedar Rapids, which there's a thriving black community in Cedar Rapids that gets marginalized a lot. We had people come in and just talk to the Gazette about the language we use, about how, what are you called, Muslims or Muslims? I mean, that kind of discussion, so that we had a better understanding of people who I liked to view as being islands and our neighbors, therefore worthy of news coverage. So I think dialogue can help, but it requires kind of cooperation of the bridges that are being built, that you're trying to build here, Demita, right? We have major media outlets here, and someone's here from the Daily Iowa too, and so this is a good start, where you actually kind of learn about what's going on in the community, so that you start reporting about them in an authentic way, not an anthropological way.
So I'd like to kind of reframe the question again and allow for either Lauren or Zach, who haven't spoken yet, to speak. What does an alliance between grassroots and less grassroots media look like, and how can we be intentional about that relationship?
Thank you.
Absolutely. To the question that we posed, is there an opportunity there? The answer is yes. And one of the things at a very practical level is, how do you know your organization? Or how do you know your community? And that's something that's always evolving. And the voices that are interested in the topic today, how do you follow the transitions? That's something that we've struggled with. Straight up, our organization struggles with that. Maybe there's a reporter who's passionate and goes in. It goes down to trust. How much do people trust each other to talk? Some of these issues are not easy. The light that we brings crap into your own individual life, sometimes. And so there's a lot of trust that needs to be built into some of these discussions, just by the attention that is brought as a result of appearing as a voice. And so how do you, as a media organization, how do you understand that? How do you build that trust, and how do you build dialogue? We'll collaborate with any organization. We've done a lot of that, as long as we're open about what we're trying to achieve and feel good about that there's a synergy there. And I think that that's increasingly important. One of the questions and one of the struggles that I have that keeps me up at night is, it's easier than ever to get your message out there. It's harder than ever to hear it. And how do you keep these conversations to have that critical mass where you can impact change? Because if you have a podcast and it has an audience of 10, how do you grow that in a way that is fast enough to have an impact? And those are challenges that I think are happening, because the more that you can, every individual, whether it's quilting or whether it's about an issue involving race, you can identify with a group that thinks like you do or is interested in only that thing and spend all of your time and never have to challenge yourself to figure out, okay, how do I, fit in a world where people think differently? And that's a real challenge when you're starting to leverage the voices and the reporting resources and how you build trust with organizations to have that discussion. And that's a hard, ongoing thing. That there'll be times where not everybody agrees, but you have to bury the hatchet and figure out why you didn't agree on an issue and keep the alliance going. And that's a tough thing too. And so I think there is a huge opportunity for that, and I think that that's part of the revolution that we're going through.
I think that, in some ways, as an Alt Weekly, we're very lucky in that we don't, we have this sort of set of guidelines, this sort of mindset that we bring to the stories that we tell. So, we don't come to this at a stance of, we're entirely objective. We kind of laid out this is our headspace, this is where we're at. I think the challenge that we face is still a challenge that many newsrooms face, is there's so much going on in our community, and your vantage point is what you and every person in a newsroom is personally experiencing. And trying to reach out and have greater awareness of what's going on in the community is something that I think we attempt to do every day. And getting out and covering things like protests is, slightly sexier events that news reporters are often, go to, but then don't follow up with. Those contacts kind of fade away. And I think one of the challenges that we've been trying to follow through with is, when you meet people at these events and you get to hear their voice briefly, trying to connect with them again and check in with them and see, what's going on. Have their viewpoints changed, or is there anything new going on? And I think one of the wonderful things about all of the various podcasts and other media that's out there at the moment is that as a reporter, it's a great way for me to learn about things that aren't in my world at the moment. And it's a great way for me to learn, maybe better ways to phrase things, maybe events that are going on in the greater community that I might not have an awareness of without those podcasts and websites and things like that there. So as a reporter, I feel a great responsibility to try to follow up on those things and at least be aware of them and try to pull that into my reporting as often as I can. And I think that there's a ways to go there. And I think that's something that media at the moment is grappling with, in part because the way things are reporting, and we're having to take a hard look at how our reporting functions. The sources that we rely on are often the PR people. They're easy to call. They pick up the phone. They're there during work hours. And I think that we're having to take a hard look at, is that the person that we should call? Is the person that we know is going to be there and call us back? Is that the best source for this? And maybe we'll try to reach a couple other people, or go out and see if we can't find someone who would be a better resource. And it's a challenge with time, with the small number of reporters that we have, but it's something that we've definitely taken a hard look at over the past year, 2 years, and really started to try to address it and adjust.
So I'd like to allow for perhaps one or two remarks before we transition to our breakout sessions. So if there are any more comments or questions at this time, yes.
I just wanted to say that I don't really think that there's a choice in the matter for non-white settler descendants to allow for people of color to join the media world, just because as of 2014, the U.S. Census Bureau stated that And there are more than 20 million children under the age of 5 living in the US, and 50.2% of them are considered quotation minorities. So the population demographics in this country are changing quickly and at a rate that is actually quite alarming for white supremacists, which is why they are doing what they're doing right now. This is what I would call a death throw. They are, fighting their last fight at the moment, which is why we have Trump as a president at the moment. But as I was saying, I don't really think there's a choice that we have to make. I mean, I think it's just going to happen because we are growing in number, and that's the good news. So beyond that, there are a ridiculous amount of grassroots media groups coming up right now that are doing amazing things, and I'm happy to be a part of one. Seeding Sovereignty is a indigenous women's-led grassroots media group that I work for. I'm a media hub organizer, both for that and for Seven Fires Media, which is another indigenous-led media group. I'm considered the Midwest Bureau Chief. So I'm an example. I'm an example right here of grassroots indigenous organizing happening in a state where it's like, what, 90% white majority here? There's only 14,000 Native Americans living in Iowa. And then there's the Meskwaki Nation, which makes up 1,400 people. So I'm proud to say that this is happening, and I'm sitting here right now as an example of that. So that's the way I see media going. There's just no choice.
Hi, before the hand in the audience, I just wanted to quickly say that millennials are, defined as folks who are about under 30, and they are not reading newspapers, they're not watching TV. We don't even have cable. So, there are new things happening that we can teach in an intergenerational way, and if media isn't willing to reshape the way that it's presented, then it will disappear because millennials are not going to be under 30 forever. And, I think that's something we need to pay attention to as well. And then also if mainstream newspapers are working with underrepresented groups or marginalized groups, I think that's fantastic and great. But I would also ask folks here and then elsewhere, doing that work, how are you compensating those particular groups? Are you hiring them as consultants on a weekly basis for your newspaper? Are you, is it annual? Is it quarterly? Or is it, once in a while if there's a tiki torch sale or something, right? When are those folks tapped into, right? And so I think that that's something. And how are they valued? And are your internships paid, right? So students of color can actually afford to learn from you. So those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves too.
Just very quickly on the collaboration piece, I think you'll see a lot more of that, and in fact, you've already seen examples of that. For example, Huffington Post started off as like a sort of an aggregator, curator of news and whatnot. Now it's just this big multimedia, does a lot of different things. But as of very recently, they started partnering with, they have a contributor program where they started partnering with sort of local influencers in various communities across the country. One of those communities being Des Moines. And so now if you open up, not you can open up, but if you read the Huffington Post, you'll find Des Moines contributors talking about the Des Moines art scene, Des Moines politics, et cetera, et cetera. Now imagine if other platforms, other media organizations do this as well. It's very conceivable to see the Cedar Rapids Gazette doing something like this. It's very easy for the Iowa City Press Citizen to do something like this, tapping into influencers or platforms that have a sort of established niche community where it's not quite huge, but there's a high level of engagement that original platform may be missing. I think you'll see a lot more of that, and I think that's a way to that you'll see collaboration or a co-optedness, not a co-optedness, but cooperative approaches to media, large and small.
I have
I apologize. Not co-opted, but cooperative. I apologize.
There was a question. I can't see you now, but yeah.
No, I know. You've kind of answered my question, but I'm hearing a lot that you're sort of expecting, or you're predicting, or maybe it's already happened, that the role of media is going to change in general. I mean, from all of you, that the role of media now is not just to report the news that's comfortable for people to hear, what's happened in my community or in my country or my world, but this is what you need to know. As a member of the world, you need to know these kinds of things. And there are some publications that are better at that. They have more in-depth. They choose topics that you wouldn't have any knowledge about till you pick it up and read it in that. I mean, I think of the New Yorker. They're always doing a whole different kinds of things that you never think you have any interest in until you read the article.
Read it, yeah.
But even if the Press Citizen has different, is that changing? Is there the chance for them to think of what the community needs to know rather than just, how the football team's doing? That I'm using that only as a supreme contrast. But, and is it because of all the other media, all the podcasts and all the things that we access that are not print or even reading the newspaper online? Is that why it's happening? Is to be competitive, or is it because there's so much going on that really does affect us, but we should. As a citizen, again, we need to know these things.
I would say that there's a little bit of both. I mean, we are, as a legacy, what we call legacy journalism, the newspaper, we've had to evolve in a lot of ways to be able to keep up with everything else. There's a lot of disruption, media disruption out there, and all sorts of cool new ways that people are getting their news. So traditionally, just being able to put the news out there and just, it show up on your doorstep and just say, okay, we're done. We've really had to change the way that we get to know our audience better and inform our audiences in better ways. A lot of, I know throughout the USA Today network, there's a lot more what we call cause journalism, where journalists aren't just, they're on your traditional beats of crime or K-12 education, but they really focus more on how the community is impacted. So instead of just going and covering a school board meeting, it's like, well, what is really happening, and why should you even really care about it? And honestly, just from seeing the way that our stories are read, we can look at how people interact with our stories online. The kind of news that we give people that gives them more in-depth kind of analysis of what's going on and what's happening is more, it's more welcomed by readers than just, this is what happened at the game, or this is what happened. We have had to change the way that we even tackle sports journalism for that matter. Having more analytical looks and having a deeper understanding of what's happening in communities, it seems to be what more people want to read from what we can see from the digital metrics that we have. So that does change. It has changed a lot. And is it to be competitive? Sure. We want to be able to have more people read the work that we do. I mean, that's how our journalists pay their rent every week, and how we keep doing what we're doing. But it's also because we know that seems to be more impactful in our communities, and that makes a difference than doing what we had just done for years and years and years.
Yeah, I don't want to be the contrarian view, but our web metrics are different, and I was going to give the entertainment, the blurring of entertaining and news is increasingly an impact. How do you make this sexy? How do you get this? You're competing with stupid stories that have way less impact in the global scale, yet you're trying to compete for people's attention. Our web analytics for the Gazette are Hawkeye football, cops and courts briefs, obits, and then anything else. And so that's
That's sad. I mean.
and so, we're a free website, there's no paywall that's out there. That's indicating what people are choosing to engage in. And that's a difficult spot, because when you start to think of, why don't more people care about some of these topics? Well, then you're off into the theories of, well, maybe they just want an escape, or and then all of the discussion of the serious issues. I mean, yes, our print product is focused more on analytical and in-depth storytelling. Our online platform, just think of it, when you're sitting there reading your phone, your attention span isn't to read a 5-minute story, it's 3 sentences of fact. And no matter how good you are as a writer, there are only so many facts you can get in those 3 sentences, or 145 characters, unfortunately, and we're seeing new lows in that about every day. And so I think that there is a real competition with entertainment and a competition for attention that's making some of these conversations and making us more disconnected.
I said competition with escapism. That's
Yeah.
basically what he said. A lot of us just want to escape from reality when we know we can't.
And that's been reflected in advertising dollars that support media. When we talk about the disruption, in 2002, 2001, around there were something like 54,000 reporters and editors in newsrooms across the country, newspaper newsrooms, I should say. That number now is below 40,000. And so that's been that drop over the 17 years. So that's part of the disruption. So you have fewer reporters. Our friends at the table here have fewer reporters than they had at their shops 10 years ago. And you figure that a reporter might be able to produce 3 to 5, if they're really productive or they're at a busy meeting, 3 to 7 stories a week, but just figure 3 stories. And if you show 10 reporters the door over a period of time, that's 30 stories a week that are no longer being reported. So that has an impact.
But I don't think we're going to fix any problems with the media or access by sort of holding on to the way things used to be, right?
Exactly.
I think that newsrooms and media organizations and publications just need to be creative, need to understand the world as it exists today, and then sort of start to try to chart out how where the future is going. I mean, you hear sometimes you hear stories about publications that dismiss the relevancy of the internet, right? Some of those publications are no longer around today. So it requires us all to be more creative. I think tap into established communities where there's a high level of engagement around an issue or maybe around an individual. And I think that talent at some of these newsrooms needs to get better and more diverse as well. To bring in fresh ideas and innovative perspective, people that are more intuitively comfortable with social media, all these other platforms as well. But I think it just requires us to sort of embrace sort of the future and where media is going.
All right, so I think at this time we're going to transition to our breakout sessions. I want to thank the panelists for taking their time here to give some applause. So up next, so I'll give you a little framework for what we're going to do moving forward. There's going to be 2 different breakout sessions, and we'll do a time frame of 1:45 to 2:30 for these next 2, and then the following session will take place from 2:30 to 3:30. And so our sessions coming up right now are in media literacy, and the other is building a conversation, media activism and community journalism.